Good morning, everyone. So our next speaker is Dushyant from Deakin University. He's going to be talking today about the challenges of providing services for over 100,000 users, where over 80% of their devices are unmanaged. Please welcome Dushyant.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction. This way, sorry. There you go. So my name is Dushyant. I work as a security operations manager at Deakin University. And I've been there for quite some time now. This is my 10th year at Deakin, so I've been institutionalized, for a better word. So who are we? So a lot of people, you might have run into a lot of university folks here, but I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the complexity of this organization. So universities are more like a mini city in itself. So they're very complex environments, hugely diverse population. So we have around 64,000 students, 14,000 staff across 4 campuses in Victoria, and I believe we have about 120 buildings that we run and manage. 14,000 managed workstations, 3,000 plus servers, 2 data centers, 340 staff in IT, and only 11 in cybersecurity. That's including the SOC team, which is my team. So move on to the next slide. So today, I'm going to be talking a bit about our zero trust strategy, how we're doing device posture. So today's presentation is going to focus a lot more on device posture, and is also going to talk about the lessons we've learned, what have we done to actually get to where we are, and what are we planning to do next. So zero trust. I know this is probably the 4th presentation that I've seen in the last 2 days that's talked about zero trust. And it's interesting because it's not the best phrase out there. It's not my favorite. If it was for me, I would have said something like building trust or something more positive, because I feel like zero trust has a very, very negative connotation. But I'm not in marketing. I'm not making all of these calls. So anyway, so our zero trust policy has actually, Zero Trust Foundation has been inspired from the CIS's Zero Trust Foundation architecture. So they actually have this is still in draft stage, but it's a really good document. I have a link down at the bottom for anyone interested. It talks about the 5 fundamental pillars and the architecture that's required to actually get to where we need to in terms of zero trust. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be talking more about identity and device health and how we've done that at the university level. So the CISA also talks a bit about maturity and how you actually rate yourself against each of these pillars. So in terms of identity, there are 3 different levels of maturity. So there's a traditional maturity, there is advanced and optimal. So traditional is essentially where you have an organization that's just using passwords for authenticating into a system. There's some risk assessment on understanding what are your critical high-risk applications and stuff. And in advance, you're doing things like multi-factor authentication. You have some federated identity. Most universities do. We use Australian Access Federation to interact and collaborate with other universities across the board. And optimal is when you're actually doing that extra, the continuous validation to check if this is the right user, has the right privilege, is authorized to be on the system type thing, and there's machine learning involved in understanding if the identity is not breached. So I have a mark there, and I think roughly that's where we sit. We sit between advanced and optimal. We're not quite there yet, but we've done a lot of work in this space to actually get to where we are. So we, like I said, we have around 84,000 staff and students enrolled. So it's a massive number. And we have around 441 applications last I checked. And the number is a lot bigger than that. These are only applications that we support and manage. There are a lot of other applications that use our single sign-on or federated identity service that we are actually supporting. So it could be an application that's designed for students to get discount coupons and stuff. So there are heaps of applications that we actually don't support and manage, but this is what we have. In terms of the number of authentications we have, in the last 30 days, we've had 1.6 million authentication requests come through, and of which close to 90% of them use smartphone devices, but there's a good portion of our users who actually don't use smartphones. So we have hardware tokens and text messages for them. So text messages are more for students. We actually don't allow text messages for staff as an MFA method. And in terms of hardware tokens, we have staff and students who have accessibility issues, who can't use a smartphone. We have students who are actually in the prison and can't have a phone there, but they're actually studying at Deakin and can't use the hardware token because you can't take USB drives. So it's been really important for us to make sure we provide an option for multi-factor auth for every user. So the policy is designed so that we actually don't have any exemptions. So everyone from the chancellor and the vice chancellor through to the student, everyone uses MFA and it's compulsory. So it's designed so that you can't actually exempt from the policy and there's no process for exemption. So that's why we try and make sure that there are enough factors available for everyone to be able to authenticate in. So coming more about today's topic, I'm going to be talking a lot more about device trust and what we're doing here. So in terms of establishing device trust, CISA talks about traditional, advanced, and optimal stages. So in traditional, you have very limited visibility on what devices are actually connecting to your network, and you have a very simple inventory. So this could be a simple spreadsheet with a list of devices that are actually managed by the organization, and it's not perfect, but it's something. And then there's the advanced stage where you're actually doing compliance enforcement for these devices. Your access depends on the type of device that you're connecting from, which is where we'd want to be. And which is what we're doing at the moment. And there's also a continuous monitoring, so constantly checking the health of the device and using advanced machine learning to actually do some risk-based analysis on devices that are connecting. So one of the things that we had to do before we actually came up with this was to actually prepare for doing device health and posture. So we spend a lot of time trying to identify the user group that we actually are absolutely wanting to enforce these policies on. So we clearly don't want to do it for everyone. We don't want to make it hard for students to connect and study at Deakin, especially because we actually don't provide them the device that they have. So as long as they have a basic computer with some minimum specs and config, they should be able to study at Deakin. So that's the whole idea. And then identify what is the acceptable policy, which was a lot of exercise. So we went to our management, to our support teams, to all the other stakeholders to actually come up with a plan and come up with a policy that is tailored enough and works for most of the use cases that we're going to talk about today. And then the next stage was to actually review the devices that are potentially going to be impacted. So since we're doing a lot of audit to see who's connecting, where they're connecting from, what's a device that they're using, we've basically done a lot of review to understand who's going to be impacted. So the change management becomes a lot more easier. And then making sure, since university environments are huge, we try and get to a self-service type troubleshooting scenario where we are actually not relying on users calling up service desk or service support every time they have an issue, but they're actually they're able to support themselves. So this is what the policy actually can do. So we use Duo for our multi-factor auth as a multi-factor auth provider. And they actually have a few extra bells and whistles to be able to do device health and posture. So we thought, why not? This is a great start. So what this actually does is you can see the screenshot that essentially talks about both. That's the Mac version of it, and that's the Windows version. Sorry, the other way around. And it captures information like location, so where the user is connecting from. So both location of the computer or a workstation that they are logging in from, and location of the multi-factor auth device. So if you are if your device location is in a different country and your MFA location is in a different country, that's an anomaly. So we're trying to understand what's acceptable there. So we capture all of that information. We look at operating system versions. So that's a really interesting thing as well. I'll dwell into that in a sec. We have browser versions, plugins installed on the browser. So browsers have become sort of an operating system in themselves. So there's add-ons and plugins, or whatever you can install on the browser. And most staff and students purely interact with Deacon services just through the browser. So securing that is really important for us as well. And doing things like disk encryption has also been an interesting thing and an important thing for us because we have a lot of people who have been more mobile than they used to be. So we used to have only about 60% of all staff having a portable workstation. Now that's slowly creeped up to 90 in the last 2 years because we want our staff to be more mobile than they used to be in the past. And then understanding password policies and login policies on the workstation. So this tells us that as well, and the version of the agent that's running on it. So just making sure that we don't have an outdated agent running on the workstation. So policy, this is where the conversation always gets really interesting in universities. So every time you talk about policy, everyone has their own perspective. So our leadership is like, dial up security policy. Let's go as secure as possible. Then we look at the impact and we're like, oh no, we need to dial down. So you need to get that right. Otherwise, often what I've seen in universities is you have a very stringent security policy, and then there's some research team or a major chunk of the organization gets impacted because of that security policy, and there's a massive scare, and we dial it down so much that it's almost non-existent. So it's really important you get that right. And the way we've actually done this is we've come up with 3 separate policies. So we have a policy for just doing an audit. So we have a few alerts that we've set up purely based on the information that we're collecting from all our staff and students. And we look at, we have some playbooks that look at anomalies like where's the user logging in from? Does the user have multiple devices that they are using for MFA? So we've identified a student recently who had 8 mobile devices connected to the same account. That's unusual. Like 2 devices, I'll take it. 8 devices, that's more than how much money they'd be paying for their fee just on telephone bill. So it's really important to understand what your thresholds are. So we have a few playbooks catered for that. And then we have a baseline policy for all staff. So when we first went from working from home, I'm not going to use the word pandemic, but working from home, we ended up in situations where staff were just going back home and using the workstation that was already set up on their, in their study or at home. And they didn't bother plugging in their university workstation. So we ended up in situations where we had users with privileged access to critical infrastructure, logging in from Windows 7, Windows XP devices. So that's not really ideal for us. And we wanted to make sure we have a baseline policy to say you cannot be using a Windows XP device anymore. So we've set up a baseline policy that's for all staff, and that's reasonable, quite reasonable. It's not insane to expect that. And then we have a more stricter policy for enforcement. So this is more our privileged users. And when I say privileged, I'm talking about everyone from IT admins to people with financial delegation who can actually, the organization has trusted with with the organization's money. So it's also important that we make sure that we provide extra security to those users and users who are working on critical research. So that's the enforcement policy we've had, so which is quite stricter. So we'll go through that in a sec. So this is how the interface actually looks like. So you have, when you log into any Deacon web application, you're presented with a single sign-on page, and you log in with a username and password, prompts you for MFA like every other organization does. And once you've done your MFA challenge, it then transparently, so the user would not know that this is happening in the background, would send health and postural information based on a client that's installed or the information that the browser is collecting on your behalf anyway. So you don't have to, unless you are on an enforcement policy, you don't have to have the client installed. But it'll prompt you time and again to say, hey, do you want to install this client? Do you want this extra security? Have this client installed. But if the policy is enforced, you don't have a choice. You need to have the client installed. We need to get all the information we need. So mostly transparent, but if you actually have a policy that you're not complying with, there's some self-service tips that come up on a pop-up. So in this screenshot on the left, it talks about firewall status. So the OS firewall for this Windows workstation is disabled, and the user got an alert to say, fix this, click here, fix this firewall, enable firewall, and then you're able to log back in again. So it's fairly straightforward. You don't even need KB articles and stuff to advise your staff or your students on how to use this. And on the right, you can see that there's a pop-up that comes up if prompting you to say, hey, you've not updated your browser. Your browser looks fairly out of date. Do you want to do that? So this is more an audit policy. So it actually prompts you to do something, but it actually doesn't stop you from doing what you're doing. But when we actually start enforcing, we're saying, hey, you actually do have a really old browser, and you can't log in unless you update that. And browser updates are quite simple. All you have to do is restart the browser, in most cases at least. So that's really important, making it transparent, making sure you're not adding extra hurdles is really important. Otherwise, you'll end up in situations where people will see this as an extra hurdle or a hoop to jump through every time they need to log in. Going back a bit about what our network actually looks like. So we'll talk a bit about the type of devices that we're doing this device health and posture for in a sec. But before that, I just wanted to show this graph and talk about how diverse the environment is. So we have a lot of IoTs and sensors. So the number of workstations currently connected to the network is generally not this low. Our on-campus activity is not back to where it needs to be or it used to be. But you can see the number of IoT devices on the network as well. And securing them are also really important. For today's presentation, I'm going to predominantly talk about these two bits, so the workstation and mobile devices, securing them along with all the BYOD devices that connect as well. So this policy is agnostic of where you're actually located, so doesn't really care if you are on Deacon's network or off Deacon's network. So it just ensures that you're connecting from a secure device irrespective of where you're connecting from. So this is what we did at the start. We wanted to understand what we are actually dealing with. So we looked at the number of endpoints that that are currently going through our audit policy that we're actually looking and capturing this telemetry and information from. So we have close to 100,000 endpoints that we've seen in the last 30 days. And you can see when we actually started doing this, before we started kicking off some of these people or getting them to do their updates, there were 1.4 thousand or 1,400 devices that were end of life. So end of life and end of support means that they are either running a really old version of Windows 10 or Windows 7, Windows 8.1. I had 9 Windows XP users that were connecting to our services. I didn't even know that was a thing. I didn't even realize that browsers would actually work. I thought it was long dead, but clearly not. And then we had a lot of macOS devices that were old, functional, but Apple wouldn't provide further releases and updates. So we were in a situation where we were like, what do we do with these devices? And that's sort of some metrics on how many BYO devices we're dealing with. So we're dealing with 3/4 of all the devices connecting to Deacon applications have all been using BYO devices, and not a lot of them are actually non-compliant. So we need to understand what we look for and how we actually enforce these policies. So moving on to the next slide. So this is just an example of the amount of information that we actually gather through this, this posture check. So you can actually see at the top, you get some information about the user, the workstation, and the version of the operating system that they're connecting from. So for all Deacon managed workstations, we actually have a trusted device check. So we know if it's a managed device or an unmanaged device. So a security team actually didn't care about this as much. We actually don't have a policy that says you can do these activities only on a managed device and these you can't. So this was more to just get an understanding and get a feel of it, because our support teams were not really aware of how many managed devices were out there. So we had good statistics on how many devices were actually owned by the university, but not all university-owned devices were actually managed. People did their own thing. So getting those numbers were really good. We started targeting those users, tapping on their shoulders to say, hey, why are you not using Deacon managed operating system on your workstation? So research especially, we've identified a lot of users where that was the case. And we've converted as many as we could. It's still work in progress. We're not there yet. And I'm sure most universities are going to struggle with that. But it was good for us to just get an idea of how many managed workstations we had. So that's the certificate that actually does the check for managed and unmanaged. This is browser information. So we use Cisco AnyConnect as a VPN solution. And that's also treated as a browser because we use single sign-on on top of Cisco. And every time you single sign-on, it comes up as AnyConnect, as the app connecting. And that's the user's primary browser that they're connecting from. So you can see that there are plugins uninstalled, which is good. They don't have Flash or Java working, which we've flagged as high-risk plugins, and we don't want users to be using that because we don't have a lot of applications, or most of our applications don't use either those two plugins or don't require those two plugins. And this is a bit more information that you get from the client that's actually installed on your workstation. So for users who we've enforced this policy on, if they don't have the client installed, the single sign-on prompt essentially comes up with a pop-up and tells you how to install the client. So you do it as you're logging in to your workstation for the first time. But this is all the information that we collect, which we talked about just then. So then came the fun part, enforcement. Our service support area hates us. Every time we say the word enforcement, they freak out. They're like, we don't want more user disruption. But I think we've done pretty well with our first enforcement area. We've done that for our own IT staff. And we've had 2 users who've had issues when we pushed out the policy. So the impact was quite low. So the first thing we did was we only communicated to the people that we know were going to be impacted. So we did some wider comms, had newsletters and stuff. But the moment you actually tell someone that there is a massive IT change, even if it doesn't impact them, they're going to start getting worried. They're going to start ringing up IT. They're like, hey, am I impacted? What's happening with me? What's happening with my device? So we wanted to avoid that by just doing a lot of targeted comms. And that really helped. We also provided a lot of KBs and articles and newsletters and stuff. We have an amazing communications team that has put and helped us with this, putting these things together. And we also had a process for dealing with exemptions. So normally, we don't do this. It's unlike having an exemption policy in security is not something that we would do within the team. But we had a few issues. I'll get into the challenges in a sec, but we've had a few issues where we had to deal with exemptions where it wouldn't necessarily work for a few use cases. So we did come up with a policy. We don't advertise this, but we know it's there if in case someone is stuck and they need to be able to log in. And we also, when we actually do have an exemption process, we generally have exemptions for a limited period of time. So we made sure that the process was built such that you only get exemptions for a month. So for instance, you are in a situation where you've ordered for a new workstation, you're a new staff member, got a new workstation, and the workstation is stuck with all the logistical shipping issues that we have. So you're using your unsecured device at the moment, so we provide you with some exemption to be able to do that. We support as best as we can, but you need to do what you need to do. But that's not going to be an exemption forever, so we actually ensure that that's time boxed and that's it. And on, yeah. So this is where it gets interesting again. So lessons learned. So we've like I said, we've identified that there is a lot more BYO devices that staff are using than what we had anticipated. A lot of their Deacon-owned devices were just sitting there in the cupboard, not turned on, not used because they have a cool desktop with LED lights or whatever that's already connected, but that's dated. So, and we've also had issues with software that we've had extended support for that our device health and posture would not take into account. So for instance, Firefox, extended support versions of Firefox is a good example. The version numbers are old. We're just looking at version numbers to determine if it's a supported and a secure browser or not. So we had a few people running ESR version of Firefox that we had to switch them to a public release of Firefox as well. So we had a few of those cases where we didn't know that they were actually getting extended support for the operating system and device that they were using. Initial login was another problem, so we've moved to Intune deployment for Windows, and we're doing something similar using Microsoft Identity to log into Mac OS when they're first provisioned. And we had a bit of a catch-22 situation. So when you're logging in to your device for the first time, the policy on your identity says you need to have a health app running in the background to give all the health information. But the health app will only kick in after you log in. So what do you do there? So we were stuck in situations where we had some processes that wouldn't work because the health app would just not kick in. And some desktop applications that used an embedded browser of some shape or form didn't play really well. They were not a full-fledged browser sitting within the application. Not going to name any applications, but we had some desktop apps that didn't play quite nicely. It's still relatively new technology, so it's still a lot of room for maturity in that space. So one of the things that we've been getting asked from our management is, it's great you're doing all of these things, but how do you actually measure your progress? How do you measure success on these things? Is it 100% compliance? But that's often not the case. That's not the only metrics that tells us we've done this well, we've hit the nail on this. So a couple of things that we constantly reported back to our management with this particular initiative was we talked about how frictionless the end user experience was. So we got some stats on the number of calls that we got for our support teams, the number of escalations that we've had to deal with for this, which were quite low, and the number of security incidents overall. So we looked at instances where we actually had to deal with compromised workstations, scanning, re-imaging those workstations, time spent on dealing with those workstations, so that have gone down as well. So we've measured on that as well. And the other thing we had was, this is something that is important and interesting to me. So we are a very lean team, and we often have to be careful on how we are actually spending our time. So one of the things that I often ask myself, and I ask others in the team as well, is the time that you're actually spending in maintaining this technology and maintaining this tool to the actual time that you're spending in responding to the incident. Is it like we have only 2 incidents once every year, and we've spent 3 months just getting this up and running? If that's the case, it's actually not worth it. So we made sure that this was actually going to be of business value, and this is where we needed to spend our time. So, and also, it's like I said before, it's really important that we ensure that the login does not change. So the login experience does not change. So all of this has been quite transparent for close to 99% of our users. There were a couple that were anomalies that needed to do a few things to fix their workstation, to update their device, or do what they needed to. But majority of them, it was quite transparent. So that was really important metrics as well. And yeah, so we talked about the first 2 pillars. There's a lot more to Zero Trust. We have been doing a lot of other initiatives along this along this vision. I would say it's not. I would say it's much bigger than a framework. Zero Trust for us is more like a vision where we want to get to. So we're doing a lot of work in the network environment space. So we have microsegmentations within data centers, and although we have a flat access layer network, we don't get users to jump on the network without having to do the proper authentication and ensuring that they're authorized to be on the network. We have my colleague here can talk a bit more about this, but we've been doing a lot of work with our applications team as well, building that, embedding security into application development, so it actually becomes a part of security building. And we're also looking at data on how we consume data. So universities are also notorious to not have great data classification standards. So that's also something that we're looking at, along with all the automation and governance that sit as foundation for all of these. So I think that's it from me. And thanks to everyone in the team, because all of this would not have been possible with the team and everyone else that has supported security so far in the organization. So I just want to take a moment to thank everyone. And yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah, have a round of applause for Dushyant.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Dushyant. We've got lots of questions, and I guess the common theme of the questions is to do with the technology stack you're using to support your operation. So you've given, I guess, answers to a few of these already with the use of Intune and I guess other MDM type stuff for the OSX things, but you've got to talk about that.
Yeah, so we actually do apply some of these policies to our cloud native environments as well. So we also have remote desktops and stuff that people connect to. We have students that we provide a VDI environment for, so these policies and stuff are also applied on those environments as well. So we're trying to expand it as much as we could, but majority of what we do is still on-prem. So on-prem security is still quite front and center for us. And yes, we've also looked at Microsoft Intune. The flexibility that this gave us was being able to support all the BYO devices that are not going through Intune and the diversity of devices that it actually supports. So we've been doing something similar for mobile devices as well, so iOS, Android, macOS and stuff, and it's part of the authentication process, so your students or staff shouldn't need to do anything more.
Yeah, great. Another question someone messaged me before is like a common problem that, especially in academia, is finding and retaining good staff. And how do you approach that?
It's funny. It's also a challenge for us. I'm sure it's for everyone else. We shouldn't be saying that because we are actually an educational institution. So we should be solving the problem, but not talking about the problem. What I can definitely tell is we have a very strong internship program now. So we've been working very closely with our School of IT. For the first couple of years we've had interns, it was quite difficult for us because they were all offensive security type interns that came through. So They essentially, that's all they learned in their bachelor's or master's degrees. So they spent 2 to 3 years just learning offensive security. They had no idea what defending or what blue teaming is going to look like. So we've been feeding back to our school. We working closely, collaborating with them in shaping the curriculum so the students have a much wider breadth of subjects that they're exposed to. So hopefully we'll solve this one day.
Yeah. I really like your, I guess, your threat hunting really for the users who are registering like 8 or 9 devices.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Is that an automatic detection? Or is that like a manual thing that you've...
Automatic for what, sorry?
Is that something you detect automatically now, or you actually manually have to go through and detect users who have multiple, too many
We actually
registrations?
have playbooks that we've written for it. So we actually have some responses that are automatic, but the alerts itself are manually triaged by the security analysts in the team. So often it's an interesting case. We've found very little instances where there was actual malicious intent, but there are definitely cases where we respond to very quickly and automate. For instance, if there is a sysadmin and all of a sudden outside of business hours, there's a new MFA device that was registered against their account, that's something that we lock and respond to quite quickly. So we're trying to do a few more of those checks and balances. It's a moving target. The other problem we've had with all of this is when you send a push notification to people, and if you're doing that more often than you should, people are going to be numb to the notification that's actually coming through. So we've had instances where staff would just get a notification random out of the blue, and they'd say, yes, that's me, log me in. So it's not as effective. So you have to make sure that, like I said, you need to dial that properly, the security policy properly.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm sure you have some fantastic incident response stories you could share with people outside later on if you're around the rest of the day.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so please thank Dushyant for a great talk.
Thank you all. Thank you.
So our next speaker will be David Jorm, and he's going to start at 5 minutes, actually,
Thank you.
5 minutes past 12, which is at about another
Did it make sense?
5 minutes.